Good evening. I'm Karen Kaufman, President of the New York State Society for Clinical Social Work. I'm very pleased to welcome you all to an exciting annual event celebrating our student scholars. We're very proud of their accomplishments and look forward to having them join us in the Society and to their future contributions in the field of clinical social work. Have a wonderful evening and congratulations to you all. And I'm going to turn things over to your hosts now.
What brought you to social work?
I originally did psychology as an undergrad and was thinking I was going to do research and I was going to be a psychologist. But as I sort of went along in the program, I fell out of love a bit with psychology and sort of this underlying medical model that seemed to be pushed with it. And it just felt a little bit disconnected from the world outside of the client's inner mind. And so that was something that brought me to social work. The idea that the client isn't alone in just what they're going through in their day-to-day, who they are as a person. There's a whole world that occurs around them. And there are forces in that client's life that also impact how they're feeling, how they view themselves and their place in the world. And so that systems perspective was really something that made me attracted to social work as a field.
Bianca was not able to be present tonight, but she answered a series of questions, which I think gives an excellent narrative on her progression as a clinical social worker. Bianca graduated undergrad in 2016 with a bachelor's in psychology and philosophy. The plan was to apply to graduate school for social work. However, when my father passed away in August of 2015, my main focus was working. During the pandemic of 2020, I realized that I had saved up enough and that this was my time to go back to school to study something I was passionate about. I have always wanted to work towards my clinical license and help individuals in ways in which they might not be able to help themselves. I've always wanted to be a psychotherapist and help individuals through their difficulties. I also wanted to be the voice for individuals who have lost their own, be the person I needed growing up, advocate for those who may not be able to advocate for themselves.
I have my background in my bachelor's in economics. So going into social work was never something I really thought about until a little bit later in my career. And I was working in HR after a couple of years of working in consulting. And I just realized that there's a huge need for support in mental health, like stress-related health issues, discrimination, sexism, so stuff that comes up in a workplace that can affect your mental health. So I became really fascinated in that, and I started looking into programs of what would be a good fit for me. And then the other thing that was sitting on my mind for a while was I wrote my thesis in undergrad on the effects of aging in family units. So like as an adult gets older, how does that affect adult children financially? And so I was thinking about maybe doing research in aging as well. So I was like, what would be the best fit for me? And as I sort of discovered different programs, I found social work. It's like, wow, this totally seems like the best fit for me and sort of my career goals. So that is eventually how I ended up in social work. So, and right now I love it.
I took the intro course at my university my freshman year, my first semester. It was called Social Problems, and it really just highlighted a lot of different, social problems that are occurring in our society, and it just opened my eyes to a lot of possibilities and a lot of need that's out there. And I've always wanted to work with people. To what capacity, I wasn't sure, but once I took that class, it was kind of a no-brainer for me. So I got my BSW, and I knew that I was going to go on and get my MSW after that. And I, started and never looked back.
I did a lot of technology marketing in my first couple of lives. I have my MBA from Northwestern and had done that for a number of years. And when I moved to the East Coast, my area of expertise wasn't really applicable here. And so I raised my kids and I started doing a lot of volunteer work. And then I got involved with a group called A Better Chance in Darien, which is it's an academic program where we bring 2 girls for each sophomore, junior, senior year who come to our high school and who come from kind of underprivileged academic areas. And so they come to our high school, they live in a house that we own and manage, and go through their 4 years here. They have a support group through our fully volunteer board. They have host families in our community that are kind of a bridge to help them. We do help them get into college, all the different pieces to kind of help them on their way. And most of those are racial minorities. And therefore, just kind of talking to them and realizing what they face on a lot of different levels at their homes and coming back and forth from a majority white community and going back to their own community and doing kind of having to switch who they are and kind of managing through that whole process. That is what got me very interested in, I've been involved with that for about 7 years.
Growing up, given the identities that I talk about in my paper, but as a queer Black person, I witnessed and experienced a lot of discrimination and oppression growing up. And I think academically, I was really wanting to find a place that really kind of tackled a lot of the things that I'd experienced, that my family had experienced, that people that look like me experienced. I studied women's gender and sexuality studies and Africana studies at Williams College at undergrad. Thought I wanted to be a lawyer for a moment, mostly because I think, when we think about what is the worst form of oppression that we currently have now, I really think it's the carceral system, right? So I was working specifically in criminal justice for a while. But as a person, I think my skill set has always been in relationship building, has always really been in the interpersonal, and really in the connections that I build with people. And I think that I just, 1, don't think I was suited for law school, and 2, really wanted to find a career that had me utilize my communication skills, but also had that mix of fighting oppression and helping folks unlearn oppression, but also being able to talk to people all day. And so I think social work really was a beautiful intersection of those things.
I come from a background in the arts. I went to school for directing and theater and film and things like that. And over my 10 years since graduating undergrad, I felt like I wasn't giving enough back. There was a lot going on in the world, especially once COVID hit, and all of the, racial stressors that were going on the summer of 2020. And I realized that I needed to make a change in my life, and I wanted to start giving back in a meaningful way. And I thought that social work would be the way to do it, because it encompasses society, it encompasses an environmental approach, helping from a strength space, not a pejorative, getting in there and doing it for people or trying to decide what people need. So I felt like it was a good way to better understand how to help people in a way that people want and can help them from their perspective.
I've been told my entire life that I would be a great therapist. And so that's something that was always in the back of my mind as something that I wanted to do. And that I was looking into mental health counseling because I didn't even know that social workers were also therapists. I didn't know there was another option.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, the schooling was extremely expensive that I was looking at. And I practice transcendental meditation. And that's something that I've been doing for a long time that has really benefited me tremendously. And so I actually decided to become a teacher of TM, and seeing people really experience a lot of benefits very quickly, a lot of relief from anxiety and depression and PTSD. But there was another part of me that wanted more. There were, you know, many people that I had these real connections with, and they were really sharing a lot with me, and I had such a desire to continue working with them. But then, you know, our working relationship was done. You know, last year decided, you know what, I think I want to do it. I want to become a therapist. It's always been something I've thought about, and social work opens up even more arenas. It's so broad.
So what classes have you taken that you found to be interesting to you?
I have really appreciated diagnostic classes. I am currently in coping with loss, which I absolutely love. I have an experience with loss in my history, and working through that myself over many years brought me to an understanding of how I approach grief and what helped me in the process. And learning about other people's processes in this class has really helped me to solidify my experience, and then also give me confidence to bring my experience to help others with grief and with loss and with coping with all of that. So that's probably my most interesting class at the moment.
What other techniques might be useful for the client-based population you were working with or will be working with? What are your ideas and thoughts and dreams about that?
Well, I think it all comes down to approaching with empathy and using the client as their own, really letting the clients themselves be experts of their own lives, their own experiences, more just approaching from this holistic view and exploring their histories and their experiences, and learning for themselves where they come from, what experiences have affected them and have brought them to where they are now, and how to take that and use that to move forward, as opposed to necessarily stigmatizing their experience or looking at it as a problem, looking at their past as an opportunity for growth and for strength and resilience.
The small classes, that was one of the things that I really got out of my education the most, and just the ability to share my own experiences and receive constructive criticism, as well as hear about others' experiences in the field, and, you know, the wide array of placements that people were in. You know, I was in an outpatient setting and the girl next to me was in an inpatient unit, you know, totally different experiences, but still able to relate to each other's experiences in certain ways as well. So I just love that ability to collaborate with my peers and listen and learn, and it was a very experiential classroom experience, I would say. The internship, it just has like grown my love for this work even more, and the ability to actually have that face-to-face contact with the work that we're going to be doing just made the class, it just amplified everything that that we were learning in class and were reading about, and to be able to see that, you know, in action was a really great experience for me.
The internship you had while at Hunter was at a sex therapy practice. Is that right?
My internship last semester, which is where I was working with a client that I read about in my paper, was at Weiser Sex Therapy Associates. And so I was a clinical intern at a sex therapy practice that specifically worked with queer folks and people with other stigmatized identities, be it trans folks, sex workers, folks in the BDSM community, poly, non-monogamous folks, XYZ. And I think working with folks at, again, like historically, socially stigmatized identities in therapy work is really motivating for me as a clinician. And then this year, I'm a second year, and I'm at IHI, which is the Institute for Human Identity, which does psychotherapy for queer and trans folks.
So my first one was at Samaritan Day Top Village with substance use clients, and I'm looking for maybe going into some hospice care or trauma and grief counseling I'm very interested in. So it's not decided yet, but that's where I'm looking.
Last year, and what was your placement this year?
I was part of Ableist, and I was helping launch the Reach Darien program, which was independent living for neurologically people with neurological issues, whether they could be something like autism or Down syndrome or epilepsy, or people who are survivors of brain tumors. And so I did that all last year. And then this year I'm working with Triangle Community Center, which is an LGBTQ organization that works with that community, helping with some of the issues. I'm doing psychotherapy and I'm doing case management. Psychotherapy, working with some students that, and most of my clients are between 20 and 35, working on if they feel they are, a trans woman, or someone who's dealing with family issues because they have come out to be gay, or people who need help with, gender markers, or with changing their license for their new name. That would be more the case management side, or someone who wants to do hormone replacement therapy. So kind of working in that whole group of trying to support their path through all of this. In some cases may not have a lot of family support. So that's a support that we can help. Plus we have some of the background of how you kind of manage some of these things. Organizations that can help with some of the medical issues.
I had a lot of client contact. I really got thrown in my first year. I was working in a Brooklyn public school as an intern, doing counseling with children. At first was, really nervous because I didn't have a supervisor on site and there was no social worker at the school for me to shadow or receive mentorship from. I had an amazing supervisor who was off-site. And so I just kind of got thrown in, but hit the ground running, and, had a lot of clients, and a lot of really, really great interactions with them. Like kids, most of the kids I worked with really opened up a lot.
Last year, I was placed at Friedberg JCC. It's a JCC in Oceanside, New York, and they really have a lot of programs. It's really an amazing agency. It was a really great organization to work with. They have dementia, like day programs, caregiver support groups, Parkinson's support groups. They have a whole department for special needs older adults and special needs young adults. So I was involved with some of those programs as well, and a whole slew of programs. So a lot of the work I did was with older adults through the JCC.
I was working at Carter Burden Network, so I was working with older adults and as a case manager, so helping connect them with different resources throughout the city, helping make sure they were getting meals and providing some, just like short-term counseling, not necessarily mental health treatment. And I moved on from Carter Burden, which I loved because everything that you said, I totally agree with. And I felt like when I was writing my essay, I really thought about, the life course and aging as well. And I work for CHI part-time. So CHI is the Center for Health and Aging Innovation at NYU. So I'm doing that. And then now in my second year, I am working at Elmhurst Hospital in the inpatient psychiatric unit. Okay. And I love all my patients right now. So it's been a great experience.
Field work, as I read your paper, I felt like I really got to know Gary. And so I understood, you provided depth to help me understand the challenges that he faces in life, as well as the challenges that you were confronting. Tell us a little bit about why you selected him for the paper that you wrote.
The work we did together was something that I hadn't really considered within the realm of social work. He came in saying that his two goals were relating to exercise. He wanted to lose weight and he wanted to exercise more. And that's something that I hadn't really considered would be the role of, a clinician, a therapist. I thought, something that you go to a dietitian or some sort of doctor for that. But I realized the more we talked about it, that a lot of it had to do with motivation and especially exploring some of these underlying factors that were causing him to be unmotivated and unconfident, really. One of the big things that I was dealing with is this sort of internalized stigma he had against himself for being developmentally delayed, disabled, and this was something that he had been kind of dealing with for his whole life. So it really ran deep. Throughout his childhood, people would call names at him on the street. It was a very hateful sort of reaction that he got from the world. And unfortunately, it continues, up until I was working with him, where his brother would also, use his diagnosis against him to criticize him. And so because of that, Gary viewed himself very negatively. He kind of took all that the world had to say about him and used it as a frame to view himself. And so he was very hard on himself, very low self-esteem, very low confidence. And that was sort of the role that stigma played in this case study. Gary really needed a cheerleader. He just needed someone on his team who was always going to be there to, applaud him when he succeeded and, sort of reassure him that when he stumbled a bit, that he'd get back up. And it was such a pleasure and such a, just a prideful area of that journey, getting to look back and seeing how having that positivity in his life through our work together ultimately did help him achieve his goals, even if it took a slow time to get there. But yeah, that was just something that I was really happy about.
This client is named Christina. She is at the time of us working together, she was a 40-year-old cis, white, straight woman. Specifically coming in for issues related to sex and relationships and dating. She had only been in one relationship in her life that lasted from the ages of 24 to 27 that we characterized as abusive, and unpacked a lot of the abuse that was happening in that relationship. And that was the only sexual or romantic relationship she had in her life. And so she specifically was coming in because she very much was like, I want to have sex, I want to be in a relationship, but I feel tremendous fear whenever I'm with someone romantically or whenever that comes up. A lot of what came up in session was specifically around unpacking high levels of dissociation that would happen whenever somebody touched her. And that also manifested in her sexual relationship, but also around her really silencing her needs and really struggling to be honest with what she wanted, both romantically, but also platonically. Yeah. So much of her dissociation for me in working with her really came out from her relationship with her mother, and specifically around her mother's depression, as well as history of suicide attempts, and the ways that Christina really was taught at a young age that her needs were not as important as her mother's, and really kind of had to silence her needs because of the things that her mother was dealing with and going through.
What made you pick the first one you wrote about?
Well, my paper was about my experiences working in a Brooklyn public school as an intern, doing counseling with children. She was grieving the loss of her father, she and her twin, and she was a child who was really not very expressive. If you were to meet her in a group setting in class, she also has selective mutism quite frequently. And so it was very surprising that someone who was so reserved on the outside was very quickly opened up to me. And, she expressed suicidal ideation, some very strong feelings of anger towards her father. He died of lung cancer. So, she was very angry at him because she felt that he had killed himself with smoking. So she had, there was a lot to work with from the very beginning. And it was a really gratifying experience of working with her over time, because by the end of our time together, she told me, before I even had a chance to ask her, how she was feeling about her grief and her dad, she told me, you know what, I've reached acceptance. And it was really beautiful to see that someone like me, who was felt unprepared, untrained, just thrown in to this situation of, working with her with these very tender feelings, was really able to help shepherd her through her grief and help her to understand the stages and identify where she was at along the way.
Kimberly has written a well-researched paper on what some of the etiology of student athletic drinking is, and the causes and some of the social pressures that might have contributed to this. She's offered ideas about how to approach this with education of coaches and with motivational interviewing and SBI. Could you explain that a little bit, Kimberly? SBI.
It's basically short-term counseling about alcohol use. It starts, my goal was to destigmatize the use of alcohol and issues around the use of alcohol within student athletes, and to broaden the program, not when we know there's an issue, but to have everyone do some of the basic testing for alcohol use. Kind of start that everyone is involved in that. To have a 1-credit class freshman year or whatever you start at the university that kind of goes through alcohol use and the negative consequences of alcohol use, and to move that direction, but to kind of include all of the student athletes. And then as we see some of the testing shows, there's some athletes that have a more proclivity to alcohol abuse, to kind of sort those group out and to include it into the kind of natural training program that goes on with athletes, that they can get the help they need.
Your paper called Alcohol Substance Use in Asian Americans, a macro, meso, and micro analysis and recommendations. One thing that I noticed is that it was not a case study. This one was more of an overview of a topic, and a very important topic, I should add.
Part of the inspiration for that paper is the fact that, one, the underlying research is very little for Asian Americans with substance use. But two, when there are Asian American clients, I think, there's a difficulty with how do we culturally sensitively approach care. I think, people of color and communities of color in general have a mistrust towards Western providers, I think, because of kind of historical marginalization, historical treatment. But specifically speaking to the Asian community, I think that there's a dynamic in play in which, like, Western versus Eastern medicine, despite the existence of some of these programs, like the visibility and the lack of visibility, I think makes it really hard for people to actually say, where do I go? Or is this a safe place for me to go? Even if they're embedded within Asian communities. because again of that stigma and also the shame that is associated, or just going to a place that it's so unfamiliar to you, even if it's run by people who look like you, could be something that is very stressful and difficult to process.
What do you think would be helpful in today's world?
I think the reason why I micro, mezzo, macro level analysis is because there's things to be done at every single level, right? I think at the micro level, like, we need to teach our clinicians to be as culturally sensitive to different types of topics, because there's not enough of us. We have to work with different diverse populations, right? At the mezzo level, right, I think one of the things that's really powerful is involving communities in their interventions. That we would know where to look or where to target if we had just had an earnest conversation with the communities. So I think, oftentimes communities are left out of the conversations. But there are clinicians embedded within those communities that have a really good idea and can draw really good expertise on how to deal with those issues. At a macro level, like, I think there is a lot of hard work and slow work that's to be done to really recognize social workers as people who are actually the primary diagnosis of, right? People often believe it's psychiatrists. It's not. It's the LCSWs who are really pulling up the diagnoses and making sure people get a proper treatment kind of based on their diagnosis, right? So I think something as simple as that is really helpful in terms of bringing credibility to the social work field.
Bianca presents a well thought out, insightful, client-centered case of TC, a senior in a Regents preparatory program in a Bronx public high school, who was referred for support on how to cope with challenges and anxiety. She had been bullied in the past and was hospitalized 5 times. TC has taken antidepressants since 8th grade and is thought to be on the autistic spectrum. She is a gifted writer and artist, but slept through her physics class. The student was described as anxious and depressed, isolated at school, but was more socially comfortable virtually and had several online friends whom she never met. With the goal of increasing TC's ability to trust others and to see positives in stressful situations, Bianca utilized motivational interviewing and strengths perspective. The case that I worked on taught me so much as a clinical social worker in training, some of which was unexpected. This particular case taught me the true meaning of advocacy. If the client's personal therapist, school social worker, school social work intern, and school guidance counselor did not work together to advocate for her, it is questionable what the outcome would have been. I did not expect to learn about the school system and how it operated. I do not want to go into detail, however. It's so easy for students to get lost within this system, even those with an IEP, an individualized education program. I realized how much advocacy matters for these students. Not everyone is willing to do so, but when individuals of authority advocate for a student and believes in that student, the improvement can be spectacular, which I was so happy to witness.
What has been the biggest surprise since you started your program?
There's a phrase that's like macro is micro and micro is macro that one of my professors said. And I think that was the biggest surprise to me, because when I came in, I didn't really understand that when someone said it in orientation. But as I've learned, I was like, wow, everything is interconnected. And I did not understand that. And I think that's been the biggest sort of learning surprise since being in social work. And I think that is also why I loved this book about Jude, because his life at a macro level also represented the macro systemic issues that we have. So it's hard to separate those two things. So I think that was the biggest sort of aha surprise that I had being in this program.
I think probably my colleagues, right? Like my classmates, and kind of the, perspective and nuances that they bring to the table, right? Like I think that I really appreciate, mean, Hunter's pretty small, right? And I really appreciate how much that lends itself to people really sharing about themselves and where their perspectives are and where they're coming at this work with. And I think that, I know I keep talking about this, but I love relational therapy and I love thinking about the identities that people bring to the table. And I think that that also comes into play in classrooms, right? And like what people are sharing and how people are helping each other learn, right? And so I think, I know that happens everywhere, but I think especially in the world of social work where it is so person to person based, I think I've really loved how much I get to learn not only from the people that I'm working with in therapy sessions, but also next to me in the classroom.
I guess off the top of my head, especially as someone who has a psych background, we did not talk about policy at all. That's just not a conversation that's had in psychology classes. And so coming into social work, getting to learn about policy, but not only that, taking sort of these thoughts about policy and seeing how they play out in the agency setting too. I guess that would be a surprising thing. Just, you know, going through life, and policy is sort of this abstract thing that some people, you know, care about because they're very interested in it. But getting into field and really seeing that it's not an abstract thing, it's a very concrete thing that directly impacts people in a very profound way. The resources they have available, the programs that are even being funded in their communities, all of those things were, you know, kind of heavily impacted by policy. And until, you know, I got to social work, I wasn't really seeing it play out at that like small level, that small micro level until then.
So when I think about maybe one surprise, it's hard to say, but all jokes aside, I mean, I think just how much I'm really enjoying it at this point and kind of like savoring it, so to speak. It's feeling of like I'm really doing what I'm supposed to be doing, and that you know, I think that's a rare feeling wherever you are and whatever you're doing, whether it's personal, professional, anything, you know. And so that I think that's kind of surprising me how you know, enjoyable this experience has been up to this point.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the opinion that a lot of destructive behaviors around sex and sexuality are much more symptoms of like sexual repression and the ways in which we negatively talk about sex and sexuality. And so I think that what really excites me about sex therapy practices and the work of sex therapy is about like talking about sex and talking about how integral it is to our lives and how important human sexuality is, but specifically from the lens of like, we live in a culture that is incredibly sex negative in so many ways that I think, that like the moments where people's relationship to sex can become disruptive is, for me, a symptom of the sex negativity in our culture. In my frame of like attachment theory and like psychodynamic work, right? Like I think there's a lot to be told for like the root of these destructive behaviors, right? Because I think a lot of where that goes back to, right, is like as a therapist, like I want to know like where this is stemming from, like where was this created, like what is this a coping mechanism for, right? Like how is this becoming a part of your existence in ways that you think are helping you, that might not be helping you. But I think again, the lens around sex positivity is like not demonizing that, right? Like because I think so much of our culture demonizes sex, right? Like even if somebody is engaging behavior sexually that is maladaptive, right, that is not helping them, that is actually producing effects in their life that are not helpful and are actually harmful, I think the frame is, you know, looking at it like I would any self-destructive behavior, looking at it as I would any negative coping mechanism, but specifically because it's related to sex, given our history of sex negativity, like really going at a non-judgmental and really like understanding place, right? And so I think because I think again, I am hopeful and excited about a therapy space that, you know, does the work of undoing a lot of the oppressions that people have placed on them, or that society has placed on people, right? And I think a lot of that is based in sex and sexuality. And so even if I was working with somebody who was engaging sexually in a way that was harmful, I wouldn't want to perpetuate that work, right? Like I'd want to be able to like reframe how we think about sex to not be something that is harmful and instead something that can be positive, and create pathways for that.
The other person you were talking about, where she's got the issue of, I believe it's her religious beliefs clashing with people's sexual orientation?
That was a very hard session for me. I identify as queer. I'm very, very liberal. I'm not at all religious. And, I was talking to a child who is too young to know anything about, sexual identity and orientation and so on. But still, it's a topic that comes up, and I don't remember how it came up. I certainly didn't bring it up, but I think she mentioned something about like a friend's family member who was gay.
Right, a friend's older sibling.
Mm-hmm. And then, I think I asked her, how she felt about that, and she said, "Oh, I don't like gays. I don't like trans, like." And I thought, "Oh, okay," and asked her more about where those opinions come from, and she said, "Oh, my mom says that they're really bad and it's against our religion." And I think instead of trying to debate her, a child not comfortable debating,
it's a losing proposition.
Yeah, exactly. But also as someone in a position of authority in her mind, I could have tried to influence her, giving her another perspective. But where I left it was my only response was, well, I just asked a question. If they were born that way, is it their fault? Is it their choice? And she thought about it. She said, no. I said, okay. And I didn't push it beyond that. I just opened up a question and let her, have that to ruminate on. If, whether or not she did, I don't know, but hopefully that, planted a seed of thinking at least, maybe there's another way to think about these things. But it was important to me that I not be didactic about it or, challenge her mom, her family, or her religion, and also her cultural context. This was a child of immigrants from Africa, and I know that ideas about gender and sexuality are very traditional in their culture, and so it really was an ethical dilemma, which social work value gets prioritized. I really believe in the value of social justice and advocating for social justice, and that includes advocating against bigotry of any kind, but also at the same time, cultural competence is so important, and not disrespecting someone's culture, their religion, their family, and respecting the right to self-determination. But I felt in that situation, maybe I would have responded differently if I was working with an adult, but especially with a child, I felt like it was totally inappropriate for me to try to argue with, what her family believes. It's important for children to have a sense of trust in their parents, and there will come a time in every child's life where they start to doubt that authority and form their own opinions, but she was much too young.
How do you envision your future, whether it's 2 years, 5 years?
Continuing to grow clinically. Eventually, I would like to get my clinical license. It's a goal for my 5-year plan, I would say. And just, like I said, continuing to grow and continuing to grow my clinical skill set, and continuing to obtain supervision on, you know, clients that I'm working with, interventions that I'm trying to implement, understanding, you know, implications of practice, and who I am, and you know, who I am as a social worker, and who I am in this field, and what I have to offer, and you know, taking what's been offered to me as well, and continuing to reciprocate that, because that for me has been one of the biggest things about this field in general, is the willingness for those who have been in the field to provide feedback and knowledge and education and support to the younger generation. You know, I've certainly felt that, I've certainly experienced that, and so to be able to provide that to the next people coming out of school and everything, you know, would be an honor.
So I'd like to finish school, I'd like to get licensed, I'd like to go for my clinical license as well. But after that, an area that I am trying to get experience in through my current field placement, and I'd like to explore more, is in sort of hospice social work. I think it's a very sort of dynamic field where there's a lot of different things. Some of it is resource-based, but there's also a lot of clinical elements guiding people through a very intimate and, I guess, vulnerable part of life. So that is something that I could see myself doing, and I think I'd like to explore if I get the opportunity to do so.
I think my interests have grown a lot more, and I'm interested in more things, but I'm definitely still interested in research. So I think right now my predominant interest is in aging and health disparities and health outcomes, which is somewhat similar to some of my initial interests. I just think it's grown to really include, like, you know, how does workplace mental stress, or how does workplace stress and mental health affect long-term outcomes later in life? So like shorter lifespans, longer lifespans, including like how do our relationships at work affect us, and how do our relationships at home affect our life course? So I think that my dream, if I may, would be you know, being able to practice and do therapy and do one-on-one, still have that as a interest of mine and a passion of mine. But also I think I've really shifted to a more research-minded focus, and more research jobs and opportunities I'm really looking at right now. I think after working at CHI and working with Ernest and learning everything that I am in school, my interests have just grown in the direction of like a little bit of an investigator, because social work is so applicable in so many different directions.
I study both social work and public health. So my end goal is actually to be a practitioner scholar.
A what?
A practitioner scholar. So I want to be both a clinician and a researcher.
Oh.
And I think that's important to mention, because I think that clinicians have the number one perspective on the ground of what is and isn't working. And oftentimes researchers will completely ignore, like especially in the field of behavioral health, what is going on the ground, right? So like clinicians won't believe you when you say, like, this is just an example, this isn't an actual real, but they won't believe you when you say mat treatment doesn't work in these situations. They'll be like, that's not true. The literature says that it will. And you're like, but it doesn't, right? And so I think, you know, one of my goals is take what I see on the ground in terms of what's going on with these communities, but also produce research that more speaks to those communities. So I think, for example, if I work with Asian American population with substance use disorders, maybe the solution is at a research level, at a macro level, to say maybe we need to do expert in acupuncture clinics, like I said in my paper. Or maybe the solution is, you know, to have mat treatment centers directly embedded with Asian American communities or large populations in Queens, for example. So why social worker? I think social workers have the best perspective on the ground of understanding what's going on with the state of behavioral health care. And so from public health, the public health goal that I want to do as a researcher is really push for substance use in public health research that is equitable in its nature nature, but also is actually representative of what's going on in the ground, which I think a lot of public health research doesn't actually reflect the priorities of what clinicians say are the priorities in the field.
What do you hope to do upon graduation?
I wish I'd say I'd made the decision, but I haven't. I'm kind of going two ways. I like doing the clinical work and working directly with people, but I also realize my background helps me get a voice into advocacy that some other people may not be able to have. That I've worked with executives, that I've worked with government, that I've done all these things in the past, that maybe where I can make the biggest difference is in advocacy. So I haven't decided yet. I'm kind of going back down both routes right now, and then we'll see what I end up doing. But it's just where I feel I can make the biggest difference.
What would you like to accomplish in your career as a clinical social worker?
In my career as a social worker, I haven't really decided exactly where I want to land yet. I'm loving sort of testing the waters, working with different populations, getting a good overview of different modalities of treatment and things like that. I do think that trauma and grief are very big for so many people, not even just in the loss through death, but also in childhood trauma, in not getting enough connection with other people and not getting enough support or being seen and being heard. And then you layer on top of that grief from loss, whether it's death or it's somebody moving away, or it's even, somebody's kids going to college, and now they're not in the house and you're left alone with in a relationship that you haven't had practice in, being home without kids, so there's grief and loss everywhere. And I don't think that we as a society often put emphasis on working through that grief and working through that loss. And often it seems as though we try to mask it or layer something on top to distract ourselves or just to get through without actually dealing with it.
Or hurry it up.
What's that?
Or hurry it up.
Or hurry it up. Absolutely.
Have you gotten over that yet?
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, I hear that a lot. It's like, oh, that happened a long time ago, or well, everybody's going through that. It doesn't diminish the emotional.
What support would you need from an organization like ours?
People and communities and needs are always changing, right? Like I think something that's great is just around making sure that education is continuously happening in the organization, right? And there's always like tools and resources and trainings and ways that people can tap into how communities are shifting and the ways in which community needs are shifting. And I know that I think a lot about like race, gender, and sexuality, right? And I think that's always something that's shifting and always places for people to have more knowledge, right? And so I think, having resources for folks to really be able to learn more about that and be more in touch would be really important.
Somebody who's new in the field to be able to collaborate and listen to others who have been in the field for much longer than I have, listen to their experiences, listen to their points of view, only helps me more, only adds to my toolkit and the knowledge and the resources that I'm able to provide to the people that I am working with on a daily basis. So, I love working. I love being in the field and really getting into that part. And I also love to sit and listen to others' experiences. And like I was mentioning about the classroom piece, I feel like that is a similar type of environment to these presentations and meetings.
I've been really interested in seeing all the updates and all the continuing educations out there. Finding a community that gives support to other clinical social workers and other social workers is an amazing thing, because just like our clients suffer and have things they have to face, so do the social workers. And having a support group that they can reach out to when they have a problem with a client, or when they're having an issue themselves, or when there's some training that they're looking for because they have a new client who's in an area they're not as familiar with. I think that's amazing. So I've really enjoyed reading everyone's emails of, I'm looking for this, what about that? I've really enjoyed that support piece of it.
I've actually thought about that a lot because I just talked to someone who was like, oh, I'm interested in going back to school for social work. And I was like, let me tell you, I have so many thoughts. But I would say my biggest piece of advice, if I'm going to call it advice, is that I think that if you're starting out in this path, there's so many opportunities in terms of the depth and the width of what you can do with a degree like this. Is keep your mind open in terms of what you are interested in doing, because I think a lot of people come in and they're interested in very much of being like, I'm going to only work with adults, and then they take an adolescent class and they're like, wow, I love doing this. And if they continue to be like, I'm working with adults, they really shut themselves off from learning and being involved in something that they might be really good at. So I think that would be one of my things that I've learned for myself. And the other thing, I guess my three pieces of advice, my second piece of advice is sort of go where your heart takes you, which sounds cheesy, but like, I don't think I would have ended up in social work if I didn't follow that sort of mentality of like moving toward like where your heart or your interest and where your really passionate like excitement comes from. And I think that's easy to get like drowned out by the narratives of the world and sort of what society or like Instagram or these social media platforms like tell you how you should be living. So I think those are my main two pieces of advice. And then my third one is do the readings, which is sort of silly, but I feel like I've learned so much from reading. And I wouldn't have gotten the depth of knowledge that I have without doing a lot of the readings, even if they're unnecessary. And even if I'm like pressed on time, like I feel like I will always look at the readings to be like, okay, which ones really stand out to me, and making sure that I do that for every class.
For folks who are interested in social work school, I think that, thinking about what the impact is you want to have on people, right? Because I think, again, so much of it is working with people, right? And really kind of interacting with people and building relationships with people. And so I would always, with people who are interested in social work, I think I'd always kind of start there, thinking about like, okay, like how do you want to engage with folks? Like, what do you want that to look like? Is that something that you're interested in? Because that is so much of our work and so much of what I personally love about the work.
I guess the advice that I could have used when I was starting out is that you're not going to be perfect. You're not going to be good most days, but you're learning, and you're learning from your mistakes. And that's just part of the process. You have a whole support staff, you have supervision, you have professors who are there to help you learn and make sense of areas where you thought you could have done something differently, you thought you could have done something better. And that it's a process, it's a learning process. And to just have a little patience for yourself as well.
I'm trying to tell myself like not to feel frustrated if I feel like I'm not getting what I necessarily wanted out of some of my classes or my internship, because there's so much more learning. There's so many learning opportunities available, and that's one of the beauties of this profession. Just to keep your eyes on the prize. School is always going to be stressful. There are so many continuing education offerings, and the learning in social work is really lifelong. And there is so much learning to be done in the field and on our own.
In my field placement, in my first field placement, I noticed that because of the population that we're working with, because of the demands of the organization, because of the funding, the short funding, kind of all the time, the large caseloads, I noticed that there seemed to be a lot of burnout, a lot of stress, and while that's perfectly understandable, everybody can be affected by that. It can really deter from the way that we work with clients. So if anything, I would want to sort of put out there a plea to just remember to put the focus on the client. Remember to to bring that empathy, remember to bring the connection, because without it, we aren't making as much of a difference as we could be, because clients end up feeling cut off. They end up feeling pushed aside. I had a lot of clients tell me that they didn't feel very important in their treatment. Like they were just sort of being pushed through the process of it. And that was heartbreaking for me. And I think that if we're able to keep that empathetic focus on the client, we can build better relationships and build community and connect on a more real level. And that to me is really what social work is about, is connection, is making those connections and making that community so that we can grow together. I can grow from what I learned from the clients. Hopefully the clients can grow in their time with me and with other social workers. So really just making those connections and remembering why we're there and what we're trying to accomplish.
In terms of just being open to learning, being open to new experiences, new types of people. I think that all of us kind of bring particular biases to the work that we're doing based on what maybe our backgrounds have been. And I know that in a couple of instances, that's been a barrier for me in what I'm doing. And so in those cases, when I look back on those experiences, I bring that, like, have an open mind, like listen to the other perspectives, listen to the client, listen to, just remain teachable and learnable.
Because I'm in 2 grad schools, I can really see the stark contrast in terms of the philosophy of different schools. But I would say that social work, and I believe this, is way ahead of other academic fields in terms of its focus on social justice, the conversations about race. They may not always be perfect. I think there's always more to be desired in conversations about equity and race and like gender and sexual orientation. But I think what people need to understand is that social work as a field is way ahead of the game. And I know this because I've been in other fields in terms of being able to actually incorporate those conversations. So I think one thing that I would encourage future social workers is, like, it's not like an if but when you will choose to engage in those conversations and be open to those conversations. And it's an ethical necessity to have those conversations because you play a role in being able to treat all different kinds of populations. And so I think that that's something that's really important to keep in mind when you're in social work school, is to enjoy the fact that you're at an institution that primarily does care about social justice and a commitment to those kinds of values.
Good evening. I'm Havina Allen. I'm the state membership chairperson for the New York State Society for Clinical Social Work. Like our scholars, I joined the society as a student member and quickly became active, serving on a chapter committee. For me, I found that the society offered more opportunity for engagement to student members than other professional organizations. That's why I chose to become an active member and have remained active for as long as I have. The society was founded in 1968 to address the growing needs of professional support for private practitioners. Today, our membership has grown to include students, new professionals, and agency-based social workers, in addition to those in private practice. Some of the important parts of our mission are to establish and maintain high standards of professional education and practice, to promote postgraduate and advanced training in clinical social work practice, teaching, administration, and research, to promote clinical social work throughout the state, to collaborate with other social work organizations and other professions on a national, state, and local level to further our common interests and with the goal of establishing connections with appropriate government bodies. We also work to inform the general public of the specialization and special skills that clinical social workers bring, and to protect the rights of clinical social workers to practice in the clinical manner in which we were trained. Among the notable achievements of the society are our collaboration with these other organizations to develop a code of ethics, legislative efforts to increase the role of clinical social workers in the delivery of services, and to grow and protect our profession. With the Society's efforts, 20 years ago, in 2002, New York State enacted a licensing system for clinical social workers. We continue to be leaders in providing education and support for the profession and are in the forefront of promoting the profession statewide. The Society offers an annual educational conference. Many of our chapters also provide education in the form of educational workshops and events. Many chapters have practice committees where chapter members can learn about various areas of practice and network. Some of the offerings that may be of interest to students and new professionals include mentorship groups in most chapters, where we talk about the next steps after graduation, including New York State licensing process and some job search advice, full access to chapter-based listservs, and lots of networking opportunities. Our scholarship program, like most Society events, is made possible by our volunteer members. I'd like to thank the following members who took time to review scholarship applications. I'd also like to thank the many faculty and staff at the statewide MSW programs who also helped make this program possible. And now, if you're watching this live, please use the Zoom link that was emailed to you to join our after party where you can meet and congratulate our scholars. Thank you.